When I woke up in that hospital bed, barely able to breathe, the first words out of my mother's mouth weren't, "Thank God you're alive." They were, "We're not taking that baby." I had just survived a car accident that should have killed me. My 3-week-old daughter was alone at the crash site, screaming in her car seat. And my own parents, they just walked away. If you're as shocked as I was, hit that like button right now. And subscribe to True Revenge Tales, because what my grandfather did next, it's something you won't believe. Trust me, you need to hear this whole story. My name is Sarah, and 3 years ago, I thought I knew exactly who my family was, what they stood for, and where I belonged in their carefully constructed world of appearances and expectations. I was wrong about all of it, and it took nearly dying to see the truth that had been hiding in plain sight my entire life. Let me take you back to that rainy October evening when everything I thought I knew shattered like the windshield of my Honda Civic, spreading into a million irreparable pieces across a dark, wet highway. I was 23 years old, barely out of college with my communications degree still smelling like fresh ink, and I was a mother to the most beautiful 3-week-old baby girl the world had ever seen. Her name was Emma, and she was my miracle, my purpose, my reason for breathing. She had these tiny perfect fingers that would wrap around mine with surprising strength, eyes that were starting to shift from newborn blue to what I suspected would be hazel like mine, and this little cry that sounded like a kitten mewing when she was hungry. I loved her with a ferocity that surprised even me, a love so deep and instinctual that it felt like it had been carved into my bones the moment they placed her on my chest in the delivery room. But here's the thing nobody tells you about unconditional love: sometimes you're the only one feeling it. Emma's father, Derek, had been my college boyfriend, the guy the first thought I'd marry someday, the one who talked about our future with such conviction that I actually believed him. When I showed him the positive pregnancy test, his face went pale, then gray, then he just stood up and walked out of my apartment without saying a word. He texted me 3 hours later, "I can't do this. I'm sorry. Don't contact me again." Just like that, the father of my child vanished like smoke, blocking my number, dropping out of school, moving back to whatever small town he came from. I heard through mutual friends that he told everyone I had tried to trap him, that the baby probably wasn't even his, that I was crazy and obsessive. The lies hurt almost as much as the abandonment, but I didn't have time to wallow because I had a much bigger problem looming on the horizon: telling my parents. My mother, Patricia Hamilton, was the kind of woman who had her entire life color-coded and laminated, where image was everything and reputation was currency more valuable than gold. She wore pearls to the grocery store, had her hair done every Thursday at exactly 2 p.m., and believed that success was measured by the size of your house and the impressed looks you got at the country club. My father, Richard, was a successful financial advisor who had learned early in his marriage that agreeing with my mother was the path of least resistance, so he nodded along to whatever she said like a dashboard bobblehead, keeping the peace by keeping his mouth shut and his opinions buried. They had plans for me, you see, glorious, prestigious plans that involved me working at a top marketing firm, marrying someone from a good family, which was code for wealthy and well-connected, and providing them with grandchildren at the appropriate time, which meant after I was 30, established, and properly married with a wedding they could brag about for years. An unplanned pregnancy at 23 with a boyfriend who abandoned me. That wasn't anywhere in their carefully outlined plan for my life. I'll never forget the look on my mother's face when I told them I was pregnant. We were sitting in their pristine living room with its white carpets and uncomfortable antique furniture that was more for show than actual sitting, and I had rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times in my head, but when the moment came, the words just tumbled out graceless and raw. I'm pregnant, and Derek is gone, and I'm keeping the baby. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick enough to choke on, and I watched my mother's face cycle through shock, disgust, anger, and finally settle on cold disappointment. "You've ruined your life, Sarah," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Everything we've worked for, everything we've invested in you, your education, your opportunities, your future, you've thrown it all away for one careless mistake. I tried to explain that I loved this baby already, that I could finish school online, that I could make it work, but she held up one perfectly manicured hand to silence me. Don't expect us to help you raise your mistake, she continued, and each word landed like a physical blow. If you choose to keep this baby against our advice, you're on your own. We will not be free babysitters. We will not be funding your poor choices. You made your bed, now you'll lie in it. My father just sat there, examining his hands like they were the most fascinating things he'd ever seen, saying nothing, defending nothing, just letting my mother's words fill the room like toxic gas. But I had hope, foolish and stubborn hope that clung to me through the pregnancy and those first difficult weeks after Emma was born. I thought once they saw her, once they held her tiny body and looked into her eyes, once they saw how much she looked like my baby pictures, they would melt. Isn't that what always happens in the movies? The stern grandparents take one look at the baby and their hearts grow 3 sizes and suddenly everything is forgiven. I would send my mother photos of Emma, and she would respond with one-word texts, nice. I would call my father at his office and tell him about Emma's first smile, and he would say, that's good, Sarah, but I have to get to a meeting. They came to the hospital when she was born, stayed for exactly 15 minutes, looked at her through the nursery window without asking to hold her, and left. My mother's parting words were, she's cute, but babies always are. Wait until reality sets in. 3 weeks later, I was still waiting for reality to set in the way she predicted, still waiting to regret my choice, still waiting to wish I'd given Emma up for adoption like they'd suggested. But that regret never came. Instead, I fell more in love with my daughter every single day, even through the sleepless nights and the fear and the overwhelming responsibility of keeping another human alive on my own. I was surviving on my savings and the small amount of maternity leave pay I got from the part-time marketing job I'd managed to land during my 3rd trimester, living in a tiny 1-bedroom apartment where Emma's bassinet was squeezed between my bed and the wall, eating ramen and canned soup so I could afford diapers and formula to supplement when my breast milk wasn't enough. That October evening, I had taken Emma to her 3-week checkup at the pediatrician's office across town, the only one who accepted my insurance. The doctor said she was perfect, growing beautifully, healthy and strong despite everything. I felt such relief hearing those words, such pride that I was managing to keep her alive and thriving even though I had no idea what I was doing half the time. The appointment ran late because the doctor was backed up, and by the time we got back to the car, the sky had opened up and rain was coming down in sheets, that heavy autumn rain that feels cold and angry. Emma was fussy because she was hungry and tired, making those little whimpering sounds that always broke my heart, so I fed her in the parking lot, sitting in the backseat with her while rain pounded on the roof. Then I strapped her carefully into her car seat, that car seat I'd bought secondhand but had inspected a dozen times to make sure it was safe, that car seat that had gotten perfect ratings and cost me nearly 2 weeks of grocery money. I checked the straps 3 times like I always did, making sure they were snug but not too tight, that the chest clip was in the right position, that her head was supported. Emma looked up at me with those solemn baby eyes and yawned, and I kissed her forehead and told her we'd be home soon, that she could sleep in her bassinet and I'd make myself some dinner and maybe we'd watch a little TV together while I fed her again before bedtime. Just normal things, everyday things, the kind of simple plans you make without realizing how precious they are. The drive started out fine, just normal traffic on wet roads, my windshield wipers working overtime to keep up with the downpour. I had the radio on low, playing soft music because I'd read somewhere that classical music was good for baby's brain development, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror at Emma, who had fallen asleep with her tiny fists curled up by her face. I remember thinking how lucky I was, how beautiful she was, how none of the hardship mattered because I had her. I remember checking the clock on my dashboard and seeing it was 7:47 p.m., and calculating that I'd be home by 8:15 if traffic stayed light, plenty of time for Emma's next feeding. I remember feeling content despite everything, feeling like maybe I really could do this single mother thing, that maybe I didn't need my parents' approval or help after all. And then everything exploded into chaos in the space of a heartbeat. Headlights, so bright they burned my retinas, coming straight at me from the wrong side of the highway. Later, I'd learned that the driver was drunk, that he'd swerved across the median doing 70 in a 55 zone, that he walked away from the accident without a scratch while I nearly died. But in that moment, all I knew was light and terror and the instinct to protect my baby. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, trying to get out of the way, and I felt the impact as his car clipped my rear bumper, sending my little Civic into a spin. The world became a kaleidoscope of rain and lights and darkness, spinning, 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 and I could hear myself screaming and Emma screaming from the backseat, that newborn cry reaching a pitch I'd never heard before, pure terror translated into sound. I tried to control the spin, but the car had a mind of its own, hydroplaning across the wet pavement, and then we hit something, a guardrail maybe, or another car, I couldn't tell, and my head snapped forward and cracked against something hard despite my seatbelt, and pain exploded through my skull like lightning. Glass was everywhere, raining down like diamonds, and I could taste blood in my mouth and smell gasoline and burning rubber, and Emma was still screaming, which meant she was alive, she was alive, she was alive, and that was all that mattered. I tried to turn around to see her, to check on her, but my body wouldn't respond the way I wanted it to. Everything felt disconnected and wrong, and the pain in my chest when I tried to breathe was so intense I thought maybe I was having a heart attack. The last thing I remember before everything went black was reaching one hand back toward Emma's car seat, trying to touch her, trying to tell her mommy was here, mommy would protect her, and then nothing, just darkness swallowing me whole, pulling me down into unconsciousness while my baby screamed alone in the wreckage of our car, and somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail. I woke up to a world that felt wrong in every possible way, like I had been transported to some alternate dimension where nothing made sense and everything hurt. The fluorescent lights above me were too bright, burning through my closed eyelids and sending spikes of pain directly into my brain, and there was this rhythmic beeping sound that I couldn't place at first, a steady electronic pulse that seemed to be counting out the seconds of my existence. My mouth tasted like copper and chemicals, my throat was raw like I'd been screaming for hours, and every single part of my body was broadcasting its own unique frequency of agony. My head felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it repeatedly, a throbbing pressure behind my eyes that made me want to vomit, and when I tried to move my left arm, it wouldn't respond properly, weighed down by something heavy and restrictive. But none of that mattered, none of the pain or confusion or disorientation mattered at all, because the moment consciousness returned, so did memory, and with memory came pure panic. Emma, I croaked, and my voice sounded like gravel, barely human, forced through a throat that felt like sandpaper. Where's Emma? I tried to sit up, tried to find my daughter, but my body screamed in protest and hands were suddenly on my shoulders, gentle but firm, pushing me back down onto the pillow. Emma, I need Emma, where's my baby? Please, the words tumbled out in a desperate rush, each one edged with hysteria because I couldn't remember what happened after the impact, couldn't remember if she was okay, if she was hurt, if she was even alive, and the not knowing was worse than any physical pain my broken body could produce. A nurse appeared in my field of vision, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she was saying something but I couldn't focus on her words because all I could think about was Emma's screaming in the wreckage, that terrified newborn cry that had been the last thing I heard before darkness took me. Your daughter is fine, sweetheart, the nurse said, and she must have repeated it several times before the words actually penetrated my panic-fogged brain. Emma is fine. She doesn't have a scratch on her. That car seat saved her life. She's in the nursery right now with pediatric nurses watching over her, and she's perfectly healthy. The relief that flooded through me was so intense it was almost painful, like my body didn't know how to process the sudden absence of terror, and I started crying, great heaving sobs that sent fresh waves of agony through my chest but I couldn't stop, couldn't control it. My baby was alive, my beautiful Emma was okay, and nothing else mattered, not my broken body, not the pain, nothing. I need to see her, I managed between sobs, trying again to sit up, to get out of this bed and go to my daughter who needed me. I need to hold her, she must be so scared, she needs her mother. The nurse's expression shifted to something more serious, more clinical, and she shook her head slowly. You can't move yet, honey. You need to understand what happened to you. You have a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, a fractured ulna in your left arm, that's why it's in a cast, and you had internal bleeding that we just got under control about an hour ago. You were in surgery for 3 hours. You lost a lot of blood. You're lucky to be alive, do you understand that? If the paramedics had arrived 5 minutes later, you probably wouldn't have made it. Lucky. She kept using that word, lucky, but I didn't feel lucky. I felt broken and terrified and desperate to hold my 3-week-old daughter who had just lived through a traumatic car accident and didn't understand why her mother wasn't there. How long have I been here? I asked, trying to piece together time, trying to understand how much of Emma's life I'd missed. About 6 hours since they brought you in, the nurse said gently. It's almost 2 in the morning. The accident happened around 8 last night. 6 hours. Emma had been without me for 6 hours, the longest we'd been apart since she was born, and I felt like the worst mother in the world even though logically I knew the accident wasn't my fault. Has anyone been with her? Has anyone been holding her? She's only 3 weeks old, she's been well cared for, I promise. The pediatric nurses have been feeding her and holding her. She's been crying for you, I won't lie about that, but babies are resilient. She's okay. The nurse paused, and something in her expression changed, became almost cautious. Your parents are here, she said carefully, watching my face. They've been in the waiting room for about 4 hours now. They arrived after your surgery. The hospital called them because they're listed as your emergency contacts. Should I send them in? Relief flooded through me so powerfully that for a moment I forgot to breathe, and the pain in my ribs reminded me sharply. My parents. They came. Despite everything that had happened over the past 9 months, despite all the harsh words and cold shoulders and disappointed silences, they came when I needed them. Maybe this was it, maybe this was the moment when everything would finally change, when they would see how fragile life was, how precious Emma was, how much we needed them. Maybe almost losing me would wake them up to what really mattered. Yes, I whispered. Please send them in. I tried to smooth my hair with my one working hand, tried to make myself look less like a disaster, though I'm sure I looked exactly like someone who had just survived a near-fatal car accident and emergency surgery. I wanted to appear strong, capable, like I had everything under control even though I very clearly didn't. The door opened and my mother walked in first, moving with that precise, controlled grace she'd always had, every step measured and deliberate. She was wearing a navy cashmere cardigan over a white blouse, pearls at her throat, her makeup still perfect despite the late hour. Her designer purse was clutched tight against her side like a shield, and her expression was completely neutral, blank in a way that made my stomach clench with unexpected dread. My father followed 2 steps behind her like he always did, hands shoved deep in his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched, and his eyes wouldn't meet mine, instead darting around the hospital room, looking at the monitors, the IV stand, the walls, anywhere but at his daughter lying broken in the bed. They both stopped about 5 feet from my bed, maintaining a distance that felt deliberate, that felt wrong, and neither of them moved to touch me, to hold my hand, to offer any physical comfort whatsoever. Mom, I whispered, and my voice cracked on the word, heavy with hope and need and desperation. Dad, I was so scared. The accident, it happened so fast, and Emma was screaming and I couldn't reach her, and I thought, the words tangled in my throat, caught up with emotion and trauma and the overwhelming relief of seeing my parents standing there. We know about the accident, my mother interrupted, her voice cold and flat, devoid of any warmth or concern, the same tone she might use to discuss a disappointing stock report. The hospital called us at 10:30 because we're listed as your emergency contacts. We came as soon as we could. As soon as we could. 4 hours after they were called. 4 hours to drive 20 minutes across town. But I pushed that thought away, refused to let it take root, because they were here now and that was what mattered. Thank God you came, I said, and I could hear the desperation creeping into my voice, making it high and thin. I need help. With Emma. The nurse said I can't move, can't take care of her, and she's only 3 weeks old. She needs someone to. I was babbling now, the words spilling out in a rush. Just for it'll while, just until I can get back on my feet, maybe a week or two. I just need someone to watch her while I recover, to bring her to me so I can feed her, and then once I can move better I can. Sarah. My mother's voice cut through my rambling like a knife, sharp and final. We're not taking that baby. The words hung in the air between us, and for several long seconds my brain simply couldn't process them, couldn't make sense of the sounds my mother's mouth had just produced. They bounced around inside my concussed skull, refusing to arrange themselves into any kind of meaning that made sense. What? It was barely a whisper, barely a sound at all, and I wondered if maybe I had misheard, if maybe the head injury had scrambled my hearing along with everything else. You heard me perfectly well. My mother's lips pressed together into that thin, disapproving line I'd seen 1,000 times growing up, the expression that meant her decision was final and no amount of arguing would change it. We're not taking that baby. Your father and I have discussed this extensively, and we've decided that we're not going to enable your poor choices by swooping in to rescue you every time things get difficult. Enable poor choices. The clinical, detached way she spoke about my daughter, her granddaughter, her own flesh and blood, made something cold and awful settle in my chest. I don't understand, I said, and I hated how small my voice sounded, how much like a child I felt. Mom, I almost died tonight. I almost died. I have broken bones and internal bleeding and I can't even sit up by myself, and Emma is 3 weeks old, she's a newborn who needs constant care, and I'm begging you. My voice broke completely on the last word, dissolved into a sob that sent sharp pains shooting through my broken ribs. Please, I'm not asking you to raise her, I'm just asking for help until I can physically take care of her myself. A week, maybe 2 weeks, that's all. We're sorry you were in an accident. My father finally spoke, his voice quiet and strained, though he still wouldn't look at me, still kept his eyes fixed on some point on the wall behind my head. That's an unfortunate thing that happened. But your mother is right, Sarah. We can't just drop everything to fix your problems. You made the choice to keep that baby against our advice, and we told you then that you'd be on your own. We meant it. That baby. Not Emma. Not their granddaughter. Not even the baby. That baby. Like she was some abstract concept, some problem to be solved rather than a 3-week-old human being who shared their DNA, who had my father's nose and my grandmother's chin. She's your granddaughter, I said, and anger was starting to burn through the shock now, hot and fierce. She's 3 weeks old. She's a baby who didn't ask to be born, who didn't do anything wrong, and you're going to punish her because you're mad at me. No one is punishing anyone, my mother said, straightening the strap of her purse with sharp, precise movements. We're simply maintaining boundaries and refusing to enable behavior that, she could have died tonight. I was shouting now, despite the pain it caused, despite the monitor starting to beep more rapidly with my elevated heart rate. We both could have died. I could be dead right now, and Emma could be an orphan, and you're standing there talking about boundaries and enabling like this is some kind of business transaction. Lower your voice, my mother hissed, glancing toward the door. You're in a hospital, for God's sake, have some decorum. Decorum. My mother was worried about decorum while her daughter lay broken in a hospital bed, begging for help with her infant granddaughter. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it wasn't so horrifying. What's going to happen to Emma? I asked, and my voice had gone cold now, flat with the realization that I was truly on my own, that my parents were actually going to abandon both of us. What do you expect me to do? The hospital will contact child services, my mother said matter-of-factly, like she was discussing the weather. They have protocols for situations like this. They'll place her in temporary foster care until you're recovered enough to take her back. It's not ideal, obviously, but it's the logical consequence of the situation you've created. Foster care. They were going to let my 3-week-old baby go into foster care, be taken away by strangers, sleep in a strange house with strange people, rather than take care of her themselves for a few weeks. My parents, these people who had raised me, who had supposedly loved me, who had given me everything material I'd ever needed growing up, were going to let their infant granddaughter be placed with strangers rather than inconvenience themselves. You're monsters, I whispered, and I watched my mother's face harden even further. Both of you, you're actually monsters. What kind of people let their own flesh and blood go into the system when they could help? What kind of grandparents? We're the kind of people who believe in personal responsibility, my mother interrupted coldly. We're the kind of people who don't believe in coddling and enabling and fixing every problem our children create. You want to know what kind of grandparents we are? We're the kind who will teach you this lesson so that you learn to stand on your own 2 feet. Get out, I said quietly. What? Get out. My voice was getting louder with each repetition, rising toward a scream. Get out of my room, get out of this hospital, get out of my life. Get out. I was screaming it now, screaming with everything I had, and the pain in my ribs was excruciating, but I didn't care. I wanted them to feel even a fraction of the pain they were causing me. Get out and never come back. The nurse rushed back in, and another one followed, and there were hands on me again, voices telling me to calm down, to breathe, that I was going to hurt myself. My mother straightened to her full height, adjusted her purse one final time, and looked at me with something that might have been disappointment or might have been satisfaction. I couldn't tell and didn't care. Fine, she said crisply. If that's how you want it. But don't come crying to us in a few weeks when you realize just how hard this is going to be, when the reality of single motherhood really sets in. Don't expect us to welcome you back with open arms after you've thrown us out like this. I would rather die, I said through clenched teeth, than ever ask you for anything again. My mother's expression didn't change, didn't show even a flicker of hurt or regret. She simply turned on her heel and walked out, her expensive heels clicking on the linoleum floor with sharp, staccato precision. My father hesitated for just a moment, and I actually thought, maybe he would stay, maybe he would finally stand up to her, maybe he would choose his daughter and granddaughter over his domineering wife. But then he dropped his eyes to the floor, mumbled, "I'm sorry," so quietly I almost didn't hear it, and followed my mother out the door like the coward he'd always been. And I lay there in that hospital bed, broken and bleeding and utterly alone, and sobbed until the nurse gave me sedatives that pulled me back down into merciful darkness where I didn't have to think about the fact that my parents had just abandoned their infant granddaughter to foster care rather than spend 2 weeks taking care of her. I woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through the hospital window, those pale October rays that felt too cheerful for the darkness I was drowning in, and for a few blissful seconds I didn't remember anything, not the accident, not Emma crying in the wreckage, not my parents' cold refusal to help. But then it all came crashing back like a second collision, and the weight of it pressed down on my chest harder than any broken rib could manage, suffocating an absolute. I turned my head slightly, wincing at the spike of pain the movement caused, and that's when I saw him, a figure sitting in the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside my bed, hunched forward with his weathered hands clasped together, and at first my vision was too blurry from sleep and medication and tears to make out who it was. I blinked hard, trying to clear my eyes, and the figure leaned forward into a shaft of sunlight, and suddenly I could see the deeply lined face, the kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, the shock of white hair that refused to lay flat no matter how much he combed it, the familiar red and black flannel shirt he'd worn for as long as I could remember. "Grandpa." My voice came out as barely a whisper, rough and disbelieving, because I couldn't understand how he was here, couldn't process his presence in this room when I hadn't called him, when I'd specifically not wanted to burden him with my disasters. "Hey there, sweetheart," my grandfather said, and his voice was rough with emotion, thick with something that sounded like barely controlled anger mixed with overwhelming relief. He was 81 years old, this man, a retired construction worker who had spent 40 years building houses with his bare hands, who had calluses on his palms so thick they felt like leather, and whose back was permanently bent from decades of manual labor. His hands were gnarled and spotted with age, his face was carved with deep wrinkles that mapped out a lifetime of hard work and harder choices, but his eyes were still sharp and clear and filled with more love than I'd ever seen in my own father's face. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days, with dark circles under his eyes and a gray pallor to his skin that worried me, and his flannel shirt was wrinkled like he'd been wearing it for too long. "How did you?" I started, but I couldn't finish the question because suddenly I was crying again, great heaving sobs that hurt my ribs and made the monitors beep faster, but I couldn't stop because here was someone who actually cared, someone who had shown up, someone who looked at me like I mattered. "Hospital called your parents last night around 10:30, Grandpa said, his voice taking on a hard edge I'd rarely heard from him. "Your grandmother and I were over at their house for dinner, we do that every Tuesday, though God knows why we bother anymore, and we were just getting ready to leave when the phone rang. Your mother answered it, put it on speaker, and we all heard the nurse explaining what happened, about the accident, about you being in surgery, about Emma being alone in the nursery." He paused, and something dark flickered across his weathered face, an anger so profound it seemed to age him another decade in seconds. "And you know what your mother said, Sarah? You know what she said when the nurse asked if they could come to the hospital?" I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. "She said, we'll see what we can do." Like it was a business meeting she might fit into her schedule. Like her only daughter wasn't lying broken in an emergency room. Your grandmother looked at me with this expression I've only seen a few times in 58 years of marriage, pure fury, and she grabbed my arm and said, "Start the car." We followed your parents to the hospital, stayed in a different waiting room so they wouldn't know we were there, and your grandmother kept going to check on Emma in the nursery, holding her, feeding her, making sure she knew someone loved her. The thought of my grandmother, soft, gentle Grandma Rose who baked cookies every Sunday and hummed while she did dishes, sitting with Emma while I was in surgery filled me with such gratitude I could barely breathe. "After your surgery, after the doctors said you'd be okay, your grandmother went down to the cafeteria and that's when she overheard your parents talking," Grandpa continued, and his hands clenched into fists on his knees. "Your mother was on the phone with someone, one of her country club friends, probably, and she was complaining about having to come to the hospital in the middle of the night, about how you'd always been dramatic, about how this was exactly the kind of attention-seeking behavior she'd expected from you ever since you'd gotten pregnant. And your father just sat there, nodding along, not saying a word in your defense." Grandpa's voice had dropped to something barely above a growl. "Your grandmother came back upstairs shaking with rage, told me everything she'd heard, and we both agreed we'd wait to see what your parents did when they actually saw you. So we waited, stayed hidden, watched them go into your room. Watched them come out 15 minutes later with your mother complaining that you'd been hysterical and disrespectful, and your father mumbling that they'd done what they could. And then they left, Sarah. They just left. Didn't ask about Emma again, didn't make arrangements for her care, just walked out of that hospital and drove home like they'd completed an unpleasant chore." I closed my eyes against fresh tears, but Grandpa wasn't done. "Your grandmother wanted to come see you right then, but I told her to wait until morning, that you needed rest and that we'd be here first thing. So we went down to the nursery and we held Emma for hours, your grandmother and I, taking turns rocking her and feeding her and telling her that her mama was going to be okay, that she was loved, that she was wanted, that she was precious. She's beautiful, Sarah. She looks just like you did when you were born, same little nose, same serious expression, same way of looking at you like she's trying to figure out if you're trustworthy." He smiled then, soft and genuine, before the hardness returned. "And then I drove through the night making phone calls, sweetheart. Called my lawyer, called my financial advisor, called your Uncle Tom to tell him what was happening. Couldn't sleep anyway, couldn't stop thinking about my son, my own son who I raised, who I thought I'd taught better, refusing to help his own daughter and infant granddaughter in their time of greatest need. Your grandmother finally fell asleep around 4 in the morning in the chair in the nursery, still holding Emma, and I sat in my truck in the parking lot and cried like I haven't cried since my own mother died. The image of my grandfather, this strong, stoic man who'd survived the Vietnam War and 40 years of backbreaking construction work, sitting alone in his truck crying over what his son had become, broke something in me. "Grandpa, I'm so sorry, don't you dare apologize," he said fiercely, reaching out to take my good hand in both of his, and I could feel the roughness of his calluses, the strength still in those old hands. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Nothing. You're a good mother who got hit by a drunk driver and needed help from her family, and your family failed you. That's on us, not you." "Not you," I whispered. "You're here. You came." "Of course I came," Grandpa said, and his voice softened again. "Of course we came. You're our granddaughter, and Emma is our great-granddaughter, and family takes care of family. That's not conditional, Sarah. It's not something you have to earn or deserve. It just is." He squeezed my hand gently. "I've already spoken to the social worker this morning, first thing when she came in at 7. Explained the situation, showed her that your grandmother and I are capable and willing. Caregivers, provided references, filled out emergency paperwork. Emma's coming home with us today, soon as they discharge her. We'll take care of her until you're back on your feet, and don't you worry about a single thing. We're not taking no for an answer from anyone." The relief was so overwhelming I couldn't speak, could only squeeze his hand back and nod, tears streaming down my face. My baby wouldn't go to foster care. She'd be with people who loved her, who wanted her, who would care for her like she deserved. "But first," Grandpa said, and something dangerous flashed in his eyes, something that reminded me he'd been a sergeant in the army, that he'd built his construction company from nothing through sheer will and determination, that beneath the gentle grandfather exterior was a man of steel when he needed to be. "I need to go have a conversation with your parents." "Grandpa, they won't listen," I said quickly, fear suddenly gripping me. "They won't change their minds. You'll just upset yourself." "Oh, they'll listen," he said, and there was absolute certainty in his voice, cold and final as a judge's gavel. "Trust me on that, sweetheart. They're going to listen to every single word I have to say, and when I'm done talking, things are going to be very, very different." He stood up slowly, his old bones creaking and popping, and leaned down to kiss my forehead with such tenderness it made me cry harder. "You rest now. Your grandmother is in the nursery with Emma right now. She hasn't left her side except to use the bathroom. When you're feeling stronger, we'll bring her in so you can hold her. The nurses said as long as you're careful with your ribs, it should be okay." "Thank you," I whispered, and the words felt completely inadequate for what he was doing, for what he was about to do. "Thank you, Grandpa. Nothing to thank me for," he said gruffly. "This is what family does. What family should do. Your father seems to have forgotten that, but I'm about to remind him." And with that ominous promise hanging in the air, he walked out of my hospital room with purpose in his step, and I lay there wondering what exactly he was going to do, feeling both worried and grateful and desperately hoping that whatever he said to my parents wouldn't damage his relationship with his son beyond repair, even though part of me thought maybe that relationship deserved to be damaged, maybe it needed to be broken so it could be rebuilt into something better, something real. I drifted in and out of sleep for the next several hours, aided by the pain medication they'd given me, and in my dreams I saw Emma crying, reaching for me, and I couldn't get to her, couldn't hold her, and I'd wake up gasping and panicked until the nurse would remind me she was safe, she was with Grandma Rose, she was loved and cared for. Around noon, my grandmother came in, and she looked exhausted but radiant, carrying Emma wrapped in a soft pink blanket I didn't recognize. "I bought it at the gift shop," Grandma Rose said, her voice thick with emotion as she carefully transferred Emma into my good arm, helping me support her weight against my chest. The one she came in with was ruined from the accident, and I couldn't stand the thought of her being wrapped in hospital blankets. She deserves something soft and pretty. And then I was holding my daughter for the first time since the accident, feeling her warm weight against me, smelling that distinctive newborn smell of milk and powder and something indefinably sweet, and she looked up at me with those serious eyes and made a little cooing sound, and I sobbed so hard my whole body shook. "I'm sorry," I kept saying to her, over and over. "I'm so sorry, baby girl. Mama's here now. Mama's not going anywhere. I love you so much." Grandma Rose sat in the chair Grandpa had occupied earlier, watching us with tears streaming down her own wrinkled cheeks, and she told me about holding Emma through the night, about how strong and perfect she was, about how she'd fought to stay awake for hours before finally falling asleep against Grandma's shoulder. "She's a fighter," Grandma said proudly. "Just like her mother. You've done such a good job with her, Sarah. She's healthy and beautiful and she knows she's loved, I can tell. The way she settles when she's held, the way she makes eye contact, that's a baby who's been cared for with love." I didn't see my grandfather again for 2 more days, and during that time I worried constantly about what was happening, what he was saying to my parents, whether he was okay. Grandma Rose came to visit every few hours, bringing Emma for feedings and updates, but she didn't know much either. Grandpa had told her he needed to handle this alone, that it was between him and his son. "Your grandfather is a patient man," Grandma Rose told me on the second day, settling into the chair while Emma nursed. "But when he's pushed too far, when someone he loves is hurt, he becomes someone else. Someone harder. I've only seen it a handful of times in all our years together, when his business partner tried to cheat him out of money, when a contractor put substandard materials in a house and endangered a family, when your Uncle Tom's first wife tried to take his kids away in the divorce. Each time, your grandfather became like iron, unmovable and unforgiving until the wrong was made right." She smiled slightly. "Your father has never seen that side of him. He's about to." When Grandpa finally returned to my hospital room on the afternoon of the 3rd day, he looked like he'd aged another 5 years, exhausted and worn in a way that worried me. His flannel shirt was different but equally wrinkled, his hair was messier than usual, and there were deep lines around his mouth that I'd never noticed before. But there was also something satisfied in his expression, something resolved, like a general who'd just won a difficult battle at great personal cost. "What happened?" I asked immediately as he lowered himself into the chair with a heavy sigh. "Tell me everything." He was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts, and when he finally spoke, his voice was weary but steady. "Had a long talk with your parents. Several talks, actually, spread over 2 days. Started out civil enough. Ended, less so." He rubbed his face with both hands. "Went to their house the morning after I saw you, showed up at 8 a.m. with your grandmother. Your mother tried to tell me they were busy, that we should have called first, but I walked right past her into the house, walked into the home I helped them buy, the home I gave them the down payment for as a wedding gift, and I sat down at their fancy dining room table and I told them we needed to talk." "What did they say?" I asked, leaning forward as much as my broken ribs would allow. "Your mother tried to control the conversation immediately, started in with her usual speeches about responsibility and consequences and tough love, using all those therapy terms she likes to throw around to justify her cruelty," Grandpa said, and there was disgust in his voice. "She talked for a good 10 minutes without letting anyone else get a word in, explaining why refusing to help you was actually the most loving thing they could do, how they were teaching you valuable life lessons, how you needed to face the natural consequences of your choices." Your father sat there nodding along like always, and I just let her talk, let her dig herself deeper, let her reveal exactly who she really is. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. When she finally ran out of steam, I asked them a simple question: why? Not why they wouldn't help, I'd heard all their justifications already. I meant why had they become the kind of people who could look at their infant granddaughter and feel nothing? Why had they become so obsessed with appearances and control that they'd lost all compassion? Where had I gone wrong as a father that my son had grown into a man who could abandon his own daughter in a hospital bed? Grandpa's voice cracked slightly on the last words. Your mother started up again with her justifications, but I held up my hand and told her I wasn't talking to her anymore. I was talking to my son. Man to man. Father to father. And I told him a truth I should have told him 30 years ago. My breath caught. What truth? That he wasn't planned either, Grandpa said quietly, and the words hung in the air like a thunderclap. That your grandmother was 19 years old when she got pregnant with him, unwed, living with her parents who were strict Catholics who believed pregnancy outside marriage was the worst possible sin. Her father called her a whore, Sarah. His own daughter. Told her she'd brought shame on the family, that she was no longer welcome in their home, that if she wanted to keep the baby she'd have to figure it out on her own. I stared at him in shock, unable to process this information, this history I'd never known existed. Your grandmother's mother was kinder but too afraid of her husband to help, so she packed a bag for your grandmother in secret and gave her what little money she had saved, and then your grandmother showed up at my tiny apartment with one suitcase and nowhere else to go, Grandpa continued, his eyes distant with memory. We weren't even officially dating, we'd been seeing each other casually, nothing serious, but when she told me she was pregnant and that her parents had thrown her out, I told her she could stay with me, that we'd figure it out together. We got married at City Hall 3 days later, just us and 2 witnesses we pulled off the street, and it was the hardest year of my life. He smiled slightly, sadly. I was 21, working construction for $8 an hour, and suddenly I had a pregnant girlfriend turned wife who was traumatized and terrified, and we were living in a 400 square foot apartment with thin walls and thinner heat. Your grandmother cried herself to sleep most nights, grieving the loss of her family, terrified she'd be a terrible mother, convinced God was punishing her. I worked 12-hour days and came home to hold her while she sobbed, and I was so scared, Sarah. So completely terrified that I couldn't do it, that I wasn't enough, that we'd fail. I had no idea, I whispered, trying to imagine my proper, put-together grandparents as desperate young people facing an unplanned pregnancy alone. Nobody knows, Grandpa said. We never talked about it. When your father was born, we told everyone we'd eloped because we were crazy in love and couldn't wait, and we just never mentioned that your grandmother was 7 months pregnant at our elopement. We were so ashamed, so focused on proving we could make it, on showing everyone we weren't the disaster they thought we'd be. We built the construction company from nothing, bought our house, raised your father in what we thought was a good home. But our mistake, our biggest mistake, was letting that shame shape everything. We were so determined to be respectable, to do everything right, after our rocky start, that we raised your father to value respectability above everything else. We taught him that appearance matters more than truth, that what people think of you is more important than who you actually are. The regret in his voice was palpable, thick and heavy. Your grandmother's parents never spoke to her again, Sarah. Never met their grandson. Your great-grandfather died when your father was 5, and your great-grandmother died when he was 12, and neither of them ever acknowledged their daughter or grandson. They chose their pride over their family, and it destroyed your grandmother for years. She went to therapy for decades trying to heal from that rejection. And you know what we vowed the day your father was born? I shook my head, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. We vowed we would never, ever do to our children or grandchildren what her parents did to us. We vowed that no matter what happened, no matter what choices our kids made, we would never abandon them. We would never choose our pride over their well-being. We would never let them feel the kind of rejection that nearly broke your grandmother. Grandpa's eyes were wet now, tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. I told your parents all of this. Sitting at that dining room table. Laid out the whole story I'd kept hidden for decades, and I watched your father's face cycle through shock and disbelief and anger and finally something that might have been shame. He started crying, Sarah, really crying, asking why we'd never told him, why we'd kept it secret, and I said because we were ashamed, because we'd let that shame poison how we raised him, and now he was repeating the cycle with you. My grandfather sat in that uncomfortable hospital chair looking like he'd been through a war, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion but his eyes still burning with that fierce determination that had carried him through the confrontation with my parents, and I waited with held breath for him to continue the story of what had happened in my parents' pristine dining room, waited to hear how the revelation of his hidden past had landed, what it had changed, if anything could penetrate the armor of pride and respectability my mother had built around herself and my father had hidden behind for so long. After I told them about your grandmother's pregnancy, about her parents abandoning her, your father just sat there crying, Grandpa continued, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. Real tears, not the kind he fakes at funerals to look appropriate, but genuine sobbing like I hadn't seen from him since he was a little boy. He kept saying, I didn't know, over and over, and he looked at your mother like he was seeing her clearly for the first time in their marriage, like scales were falling from his eyes and he was horrified by what he could suddenly see. Your mother, though, she just sat there with her arms crossed, her face completely impassive, and when your father finally looked at her and said, we have to help Sarah, we have to take Emma, she said, this is emotional manipulation and I won't be a party to it. Grandpa's voice dropped to something dark and dangerous. That's when I stopped being civil. That's when I told them exactly what was going to happen next, and I didn't ask for their opinion or their permission because this wasn't a negotiation anymore, it was me laying down the law in a way I should have done years ago when I first saw how your mother was poisoning my son. He leaned forward, his weathered hands gripping his knees, and I could see the tension in every line of his body, the barely controlled anger that had probably been building for decades. I told them I was rewriting my will, and I said it slowly and clearly so there would be no misunderstanding. Your grandmother and I have been married for 58 years, Sarah. We lived through the lean times, built the construction company from nothing, invested wisely, saved carefully. We own our house outright, a 4-bedroom colonial on 3 acres that's worth about $400,000 in today's market. We have our pensions from the company, Social Security, and investment accounts that have grown substantially over the decades. Between everything, the house, the savings, the investments, the life insurance policies, we're looking at close to $2 million that will be left behind when we're gone. The number shocked me, made me realize I'd never really thought about my grandparents' financial situation beyond knowing they were comfortable, that they'd worked hard and lived modestly and somehow that had translated into security I'd never fully appreciated. We'd always planned to split everything 50-50 between your father and your Uncle Tom, Grandpa continued. That seemed fair, seemed right, seemed like what parents are supposed to do. $1 million each, give or take, enough to set them up comfortably for retirement, to leave something for their own kids. Your mother has been counting on that inheritance for years, Sarah. I've heard her talking about it at family gatherings, planning what they'll do with the money, how they'll upgrade to a bigger house, how they'll finally take those luxury vacations she's always wanted. She treats our eventual deaths like a pending windfall, like we're some kind of retirement account she's been investing in through minimal effort at maintaining a relationship. The bitterness in his voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from him, and it made my heart ache. So I told them that if they didn't make this right, if they didn't support you and Emma, if they didn't step up and be the family you deserve, they're cut out completely. Every single penny that would have gone to your father goes to you and Emma instead. Your Uncle Tom still gets his half because he's been a good son, a good father, a good man, but your father gets nothing. Zero. Not the house, not the savings, not the investments, nothing. And I told them I'd already spoken to my lawyer, that the paperwork was being drawn up, that it would be ironclad and uncontestable. Grandpa's eyes met mine, and there was no apology in them, no hesitation. I told them that money is clearly the only language your mother speaks, the only thing she values, so that's the currency we're using now. Love hasn't motivated her. Compassion hasn't reached her. Shame hasn't touched her. But money, Money she understands. Money she cares about. So I'm using the one weapon I have that might actually penetrate her selfishness. Grandpa, that's your life savings, I whispered, horrified and grateful in equal measure. You worked your whole life for that money, you shouldn't have to use it as blackmail. It's not blackmail, it's consequences, he interrupted firmly. And it's my money to do with as I please. If I want to leave it to my granddaughter and great-granddaughter instead of my son, that's my right. Besides, your grandmother and I have been talking about this for years, about how uncomfortable we are with how much your mother focuses on the inheritance, how she's always asking about our finances and our estate planning. This just forced our hand, made us act on instincts we'd been ignoring. He settled back in the chair, and some of the tension seemed to drain out of him. The reaction was immediate and exactly what I expected. Your mother's face went white, then red, then white again. She started arguing, not about Emma, not about you, not about family or love or what was right, but about the money. About how unfair it was, about how they'd earned that inheritance through years of being good children, about how I was punishing them for having boundaries. She actually used that word, boundaries, like refusing to help your infant granddaughter as some kind of healthy psychological practice instead of pure selfishness. I could picture it perfectly, my mother's carefully controlled facade cracking, her true priorities revealing themselves in the heat of the moment, everything she'd always cared about most finally spoken out loud. Your father, though, he wasn't listening to her anymore, Grandpa said, and something softened in his expression. He was still crying, and he kept saying, Dad, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I don't know what I was thinking. He said that your mother had been in his ear since the day you announced your pregnancy, telling him that helping you would be enabling you, that the kindest thing they could do was let you struggle so you'd learn responsibility, that being good parents meant being tough. He said he knew in his gut it was wrong, that every instinct screamed at him to help his little girl, but that he'd convinced himself your mother knew better, that maybe he was just being soft and emotional. Grandpa shook his head sadly. My son has spent 30 years letting that woman think for him, make decisions for him, tell him what's right and wrong, and somewhere along the way he lost his own moral compass entirely. He became an echo of her opinions, a puppet of her worldview, and he forgot how to listen to his own conscience. So what happened? I asked, needing to know how this confrontation had ended, whether anything had actually changed or if it was just words and empty promises like always. Your father said he wanted to help, that he'd come to the hospital immediately, that he'd take Emma home with him right then, Grandpa said. And your mother stood up and said if he did that, she was leaving him. Just like that, ultimatum delivered with ice in her voice. She said she wouldn't be married to a man who had no backbone, who let his father manipulate him with money, who chose his daughter's poor choices over his wife's wisdom. She said she'd file for divorce and take half of everything they owned, and she'd make sure everyone they knew understood that he'd betrayed her, humiliated her, chosen his train-wreck daughter over his devoted wife. The ugliness of it, the naked truth of my mother's priorities laid bare, should have shocked me but somehow it didn't. It just confirmed everything I'd suspected, everything I'd felt but never wanted to believe. And you know what your father did? Grandpa asked, and there was pride in his voice now, genuine pride mixed with sadness. He told her to leave. He said, then leave, Patricia. File your papers. Take whatever you want. But I'm going to help my daughter and my granddaughter because it's the right thing to do, and if you can't see that, if you can't understand that, then maybe we don't belong together anymore. I gasped, unable to believe my father had actually stood up to her, had actually chosen me and Emma over his comfortable life and his domineering wife. Your mother didn't expect that, Grandpa continued, and there was grim satisfaction in his tone. She expected him to fold like he always does, to choose her over everyone else like he has for 3 decades. When he didn't, when he actually called her bluff, she tried a different tactic, started crying, saying he was abandoning her, that she was just trying to protect their marriage and their future, that she loved him and couldn't understand why he was turning on her like this. Classic manipulation, and I watched your father waver for a moment, watched him start to soften, so I stepped in. What did you do? I asked, completely absorbed in the story now, barely feeling the pain in my ribs or the ache in my arm. I told her the crying wasn't going to work this time, that I'd watched her manipulate my son for 30 years and I was done being silent about it, Grandpa said. I told her she had exactly two choices. Option 1, she could genuinely change, genuinely support you and Emma, genuinely become the grandmother and mother-in-law she should have been all along, and if she did that, if she really tried, if I saw real effort and real love, then the will wouldn't change and she'd still get the inheritance she's been counting on. Option 2, she could continue being selfish and cold and manipulative, she could leave my son or poison him against you further, and she'd get nothing, not a penny from me, and probably not much from your father either after the divorce lawyers finished with them. He smiled slightly, and it wasn't a kind smile. I told her I didn't care which option she chose because either way, you and Emma would be taken care of. Either she'd step up and be family, or I'd cut her out and use my resources to support you directly. Her choice. But she needed to decide right then, right there, no more discussion or negotiation. The silence that followed hung heavy between us, and I waited, almost afraid to hear what my mother had chosen, which version of herself she'd decided to be. She chose option 3, Grandpa said with disgust. She said she needed time to think, that this was all too much, that she couldn't make a decision under pressure. Classic stalling tactic. So I told her fine, take your time, but while she's thinking, the new will is being drawn up and Emma is living with me and your grandmother, and if she wants back in, shish. You'll have to prove herself through actions, not words. Your father, though, your father asked if he could come see you, if he could visit Emma, if he could help even if your mother wouldn't. I told him he was welcome in our home anytime, but he had to come alone. Your mother was not invited, not welcome, not until she could genuinely apologize and mean it, which I suspected would be never. Grandpa leaned forward and took my hand again, his rough calluses somehow comforting against my palm. So that's where we stand now, sweetheart. Your father has been to our house 3 times in the past 2 days, holding Emma, crying over her, telling her how sorry he is that he failed her, that he failed you. He's broken, Sarah, genuinely broken by what he almost did, by how close he came to letting his granddaughter go into foster care because his wife told him it was the right thing to do. I think this might be the wake-up call he needed, the thing that finally makes him see what he's become and decide to change it. And Mom? I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. Your mother has called me 6 times, each time with a different argument about why I'm being unfair, why I'm manipulating the situation, why she's actually the victim here, Grandpa said flatly. She hasn't once asked about you. Hasn't once asked about Emma. It's all about the money, the inheritance, the unfairness of my ultimatum, as she calls it. She's exactly who I thought she was, and I'm done pretending otherwise. I'm done protecting my son from the truth about his wife. I'm done being polite and civil to someone who would let her infant granddaughter go to strangers rather than inconvenience herself for 2 weeks. He squeezed my hand gently. So here's what happens next, and this is non-negotiable. Emma comes home with your grandmother and me today, the hospital is discharging her this afternoon, and we've got the nursery all set up, bought a crib and changing table and more clothes than one baby could possibly need. Your grandmother has been shopping like Emma's the first baby born in 50 years, buying little dresses and toys and books, and she's happier than I've seen her in a decade. You stay here until the doctors clear you to leave, probably another 3 or 4 days based on what they're saying, and then you come home with us too. Grandpa, I can't ask you to, I started, but he held up his free hand to stop me. You're not asking, I'm telling, he said firmly. You and Emma are going to live with us for as long as you need, whether that's weeks or months or years, I don't care. We have the space, we have the time, we have the resources, and more importantly, we have the love. Your grandmother is already planning to cut back her volunteering hours at the library so she can help with Emma, and I've been looking into what kind of equipment we need, high chair, playpen, baby gates for when she starts crawling. We're going to do this right, Sarah. We're going to give you and Emma the support you should have had from the beginning. Tears were streaming down my face again, but these were different tears, not the bitter tears of betrayal and abandonment, but tears of overwhelming gratitude and relief and love. You've given me so much already, I whispered. You've done so much, we've done what family does, Grandpa interrupted gently. What family should do. What I failed to teach your father, apparently, but what I can still show you and Emma. Family shows up. Family sacrifices. Family chooses love over convenience, people over pride, compassion over appearances. That's what real family looks like, and if your parents can't see that, if they can't be that, then they don't deserve the title. He stood up slowly, his old joints protesting, and leaned down to kiss my forehead just like he had when I was a little girl and he'd tuck me into bed during sleepovers at their house. You rest now. Your grandmother is bringing Emma by in about an hour for a feed. And then tomorrow if you're feeling strong enough, we'll get you into a wheelchair and take you down to see the nursery we've set up at home. We took about 100 pictures but your grandmother insists you need to see it in person to appreciate how cute she's made it. And next week, when you're discharged, we're bringing you home where you belong, and we're going to take care of both of you until you're strong enough to stand on your own feet again. What about Dad? I asked. Is he really going to go against Mom? Is he really going to change? Grandpa paused at the door, his hand on the frame, and when he looked back at me his expression was complicated, hope mixed with skepticism, love mixed with disappointment. I don't know, sweetheart. I hope so. I saw something in him during that conversation, something I haven't seen in years, a spark of the boy I raised, the son I thought I knew before your mother molded him into her image. He's coming to our house tomorrow to spend time with Emma, and I'm going to talk to him, really talk to him, about getting into therapy, about examining his marriage, about figuring out who he wants to be instead of who he's been told to be. But change is hard, especially after 30 years of being someone else. He might find the courage to actually leave your mother and rebuild his life, or he might fall back into old patterns once the shock wears off. I honestly don't know which way it'll go. And if he goes back to her? If he chooses her over us again? The question hurt to ask, but I needed to know, needed to prepare myself for that possibility. Then he loses you, and he loses Emma, and he loses $1 million inheritance, and most importantly, he loses himself, whatever good is left in him, Grandpa said sadly. And that will be his choice to make, his consequences to live with. But you and Emma, you'll still have me and your grandmother, and your Uncle Tom and his family who can't wait to meet Emma, and you'll have the resources to build a good life because I'll make sure of that. You won't be alone, Sarah. Not ever again. I'm sorry I didn't intervene sooner, didn't see clearly what was happening until it reached this crisis point, but I'm here now and I'm not going anywhere. After he left, I lay in that hospital bed thinking about everything he'd said, about the secret history of my grandparents' relationship that I'd never known, about how trauma and shame can echo through generations if we're not careful, about how my father had been shaped by parents who were trying so hard to overcome their own past that they'd accidentally created new problems in the present. I thought about my mother, about whether she was capable of real change or whether her personality was too calcified, too built around appearances and control and manipulation to ever soften into genuine love. I thought about my father, crying at my grandparents' house, holding Emma and apologizing, and I wondered if this was real transformation or just temporary emotion that would fade once the shock wore off and my mother's voice started whispering in his ear again. But mostly, I thought about my grandfather, this 81-year-old man who had driven through the night to reach me, who had confronted his own son with uncomfortable truths, who had weaponized his life savings to protect his granddaughter and great-granddaughter, who had chosen love over keeping the peace, truth over comfortable lies. He had shown me what real family looked like, what real love demanded, and in doing so he'd given me something more valuable than any inheritance. He'd given me a model of the kind of person I wanted to be, the kind of parent I wanted to be for Emma. When my grandmother brought Emma in for her feeding an hour later, I held my daughter close and whispered promises into her soft hair, promises that she would always know she was wanted, always know she was loved, always know that family meant showing up, not just when it was convenient, but especially when it was hard. I promised her that we would build a different legacy, break the cycles of shame and conditional love and emotional manipulation that had plagued my family. I promised her that she would grow up knowing her great-grandparents' love, that she would learn from their example, that she would understand that real strength meant having the courage to stand up for what's right even when everyone else thinks you're wrong. And as Emma nursed contentedly in my arms, her tiny hand wrapped around my finger, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the accident. I felt hope, genuine and strong and unshakable, the kind of hope that comes from knowing you're not alone, that someone has your back, that love can still win even when everything seems lost. That was 3 years ago. I'm 30 now, and Emma is 3.5, a chatty, bright little girl who adores her great-grandparents more than anyone in the world. I lived with Grandpa and Grandma for 18 months while I finished my degree online and got a job as a graphic designer. I've had my own apartment now for over a year, but we visit them every weekend. My father comes to see Emma regularly. He's a good grandfather, when he's alone. He's working on standing up to my mother, but it's slow going. He's been shaped by 30 years of submission, and breaking that pattern takes time. My mother has visited exactly twice. Both times, she brought expensive gifts and expected instant forgiveness. Both times, I told her that Emma and I don't need her money, we need her heart. Both times, she left angry. Last month, my grandfather had a health scare, a minor heart attack that scared us all. As he lay in the hospital recovering, I held his hand and told him he saved our lives. No, he said softly. You saved your own life when you chose to keep Emma despite everyone's objections. I just made sure you didn't have to do it alone. You did more than that, Grandpa. You showed me what real family looks like. He squeezed my hand. That's all I ever wanted. My grandfather taught me that family isn't about blood, it's about showing up. It's about choosing love over pride, people over appearances, and sacrifice over selfishness. My mother refused to take my newborn when I was broken and bleeding. But my grandfather, he drove through the night, threatened his own son's inheritance, and opened his home without a second thought. That's the difference between someone who calls themselves family, and someone who actually is. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to True Revenge Tales. We share real stories of people who stood up, fought back, and found justice when the world tried to break them. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't about getting even, it's about living well and surrounding yourself with people who truly love you. Emma starts preschool next month. She'll go with a great-grandmother who volunteers in her classroom, and a great-grandfather who built her a treehouse with his own hands. She'll never know what it's like to be unwanted by family, because the family she has now would move heaven and earth for her. And my mother, she's still waiting for me to apologize. Still waiting for me to admit I made a mistake. Still waiting for me to come crawling back. She's going to be waiting a very long time.